Greetings. This lecture covers the federal bureaucracy or the executive branch of government. A lot of people consider this to be one of the, let's say, most boring aspects of government, but the truth is, this is, for most people, the only part of government that they will directly come in contact with for the rest of their lives. So this is your understanding of government. This is how you understand government and how you interpret the values of government. So it's a chapter near and dear to my heart. It's what I study, for my PhD. It is incredibly complex. There are constant sort of issues on, is the government too big? Is the government too efficient? Is the government too inefficient? And things like these that we continue to argue upon. But this lecture will kind of cover those sorts of aspects and how the government works on a much more meta scale, if you will. So we'll take a look at how the federal bureaucracy is organized, how the budget is organized, because the budget is what most people fight over, how the federal bureaucracy is staffed, and the roles and responsibilities of the federal bureaucracy, and how, even though people say the bureaucracy is uncontrollable and unwieldy, we will see just how much control the politicians as well as the Supreme Court have over the federal bureaucracy, and how the federal bureaucracy in some ways can sometimes fight back, if you will, from that kind of control. So the roots of the federal bureaucracy come from the Civil War and the growth of the government, from the spoils of the merit system, from regulating, monies in the United States, and of course the different kinds of wars. The reason why we talk about that is, in the beginning, of course, and I pretty much say this in every lecture that I start, how Americans have an inbuilt sort of, natural ability to be afraid of government because they felt that the British were governing them too much. But the actual truth is that you can't have a great country without having a good government and a good way to govern the people. And it seems as though in times of crisis, Americans always look to the government to figure out how it is that they are going to get through a particular crisis. Americans might say they want less government, but the minute a crisis happens, the first thing they say is, what is the government doing about it? So right now we're having currently there are these fires going on in Northern California. And of course, the first question on everyone's mind is, how are people coping? But the second question on everyone's mind is, how is both the state and the federal government going to help us out of this time? So in times of crisis is when government tends to begin to grow most, because that's when people recognize the need of government. So we see that over here. Initially, the federal government pretty much was very, was pretty much, lackluster, skeletal, if you will. But what happened was, as the Civil War really started to increase the growth of government, because President Lincoln, during the Civil War, realized that he needed to make sure that the troops were fed and created the Department of Agriculture. He also realized that if he was going to get people to fight on his side to end the horrific system of slavery, he was going to have to create a pension system. So we got a pension office in order to make sure, the troops had to be fed, especially after a really bad couple of harvests. The Department of Agriculture was created. In the same way, we had after the Civil War, there were a lot of court cases on whose property certain places are, certain land is, or on what all the injustices that may have happened during the Civil War, and that created a Department of Justice. So as you see, the Civil War began to create more and more kinds of departments and governmental entities, just so that the government could help regulate the way people saw the United States and the way people live in the United States. So the Civil War and its after effects authorized thousands of new employees to become part of the federal bureaucracy. Eventually, what began to happen is each successive president would use, his or her power. In most cases, it was his power to kind of create a spoil system. What that basically means is, when a president became powerful and when a president became appointed, he would make sure that all the really cushy government jobs, from the Department of Agriculture and all the other departments that had just been created, would go to all his followers. That was called a spoil system, because to the king, it comes from an old proverb that says, to the king go the spoils. The spoils means the spoils of war or the rewards of war. So generally, a lot of people would, when a president would get elected, a lot of the people that elected him into office would be elected into these government positions. Now that created a problem, because that meant that every time a new president got elected, a new president would come in and remove or fire everyone from the earlier jobs and bring in his or her supporters to help them replace his or his supporters with the jobs that he had vacated from the earlier president, which means that every 4 years, all these new kind of agencies, these new departments that were being created that required a lot of managing, a lot of maneuvering, and really a lot of on-the-job learning would have to start beginning learning anew. And so government wasn't growing properly, and services were being upheld primarily because people weren't able to hold on to their jobs for no more than the time of when a president would keep on changing office. So later on we developed something called a merit system, and the merit system was primarily what do you call it? Put forward by President Rutherford Hayes, who said, rather than every new president coming in and replacing all the key positions with his new staff members, we need to make sure that we give jobs based on ability. People had a big problem with this because people were always during election time realizing that jobs could be given to them by the person that they supported, and these were really cushy jobs. And in fact, Andrew Garfield, who became our next president after Rutherford beat Hayes, was killed by a frustrated job seeker. He was one of the few presidents to be assassinated, primarily for the reason because he supported this idea that from now on, we will not fire everyone based on the fact that we bring in a new president and a new president, changes the top cabinet positions based on his supporters. But we will start giving jobs based on ability, which means from now on, if you're a government worker and if you want a job, you have to have the ability to be able to get the job. And so right after Andrew Garfield was assassinated, Congress passed the Civil Service Reform Act in 1883. It's also called the Pendleton Act. And the Pendleton Act is what created a merit system, which means from now on, if you are a government employee, according to the Civil Service Reform Act, you cannot be fired just because a new political appointee comes to office. You can still be removed from certain cabinet positions that the president removes you from a cabinet position that he feels is important to his or her agenda. But the rest of us federal employees, it covers, as the book says, more than 90% of federal employees, they cannot be removed just because a new president comes to power or a new political party comes to power. So this is part of the civil service system. The Pendleton Reform Act created a civil service system. And this idea of how government jobs are so hard to get and government jobs require so much application, so much paperwork is based on the civil service system. This idea that because it's so hard to fire a government employee has to demonstrate that he or she is very uniquely qualified for that position, has to go through many levels of interviews in some cases just to get the position, primarily because federal employees, according to the civil service system, become harder and harder to get rid of. And that entire process, that entire ethos of getting rid of a government employee is based on what I just mentioned, the merit system or the civil service system. So the spoils system was popularized by a bunch of presidents before Rutherford. I think the book talks about President Andrew Jackson. He really would promise people a lot of jobs. Whenever he came into office, he would say, well, if you vote me into office, I'll make sure that you get the job, and I'll make sure that I put my supporters in key position appointments. So this is a very famous cartoon of his where it says, to the victor belong the spoils at the bottom of the page, and he is sitting on a pig, and he's got lots of money on him, and the pig is eating at the trough, and the trough, if you look closely enough, it says bribery on one side, blunder on the other side. So here was this idea that presidents would use this patronage system or the spoil system to make sure that people that supported them got the job. And it's a disgusting habit if you think about it, because it means that people who were not qualified for a very important position would get certain jobs. And when like, let's say the chief of staff or the chief of certain important agencies like FEMA, you don't want these people not to be supremely qualified for their position, because they could lead the country into these terrible, terrible areas. And as a result, the spoil system is probably one of the worst systems that ever existed. Presidents, as I said, still do have some level of discretion as to who they appoint. They have some level of patronage, but generally, the civil service system took care of most of the patronage that happened. So, what does the bureaucracy control? And that's really important again, because as the government grew, so did commerce. As the U.S. became more populated, business and commercial activity kept on trying to increase. Labor activity began to increase. As labor activity began to increase, as commercial activity began to increase, as people began to trade across states, because these states were no longer separate countries, but were actual states that you could freely do business across. Different states had different ways of doing business. Different states had different ways of seeing what was legal, what wasn't legal. Different states had different ways of dealing with their labor force. And so it was really important to regulate these things. And people think it's a bad idea, but remember, if it wasn't for regulation, if it wasn't for the Department of Commerce, if it wasn't for the Federal Trade Commission, if it wasn't for the Interstate Commerce Commission, certain things that people thought were legal would be, or certain things that are currently considered illegal would be considered legal. And certain businesses, if you think about it, would run rampant. So like gambling, things such as prostitution, things such as the distribution of certain materials that people may consider drugs, or the way we treat our labor department, or the way we treat our labor. When the Industrial Revolution happened, which was a time when everything became much more mechanized and we started to use machines to create things, there were a lot of unfair business practices. A lot of kids were being forced to work 40, 50, 60 hours a day. People would get their hands and legs chopped off in these new machines that were being implemented to, make matchsticks or make clothes or whatever it was that they were making. And there was no recourse for these people to seek money from the organization or the business that had in some way injured them or harmed them. So there was a lot of economic growth, and there was a lot of unfair business practices happening as American companies took advantage of new labor coming in from the old world or from Western Europe, or new labor coming in from South America, or new labor coming in from China, and treating them any which way they wanted. I mean, there are terrible stories of this kind of stuff happening. And if it wasn't for the Department of Labor that started to bring in laws saying from now on, you cannot work more than 40 hours a week. And if you work more than 40 hours a week, it's considered overtime. Or from now on, you cannot hire people in certain very dangerous professions unless you give them proper equipment to make sure that they are protected from it. Or from now on, you can no longer hire people as young as 8 or 10, which they were doing in the past. It is these federal trade commissions, commerce commissions, departments of labor that make these laws that protect the American people. So whenever I hear people saying the government is too big or the government isn't doing its job, remember, this is how government is supposed to act. It is supposed to be here to help you, and it does help you by making sure that you don't work more than 40 hours a week. These are all reactions that if it wasn't for the government, the businessman didn't come up with this 40-hour work week. The businessman didn't come up with this idea of, if you're working in a dangerous environment, you need protective clothing or protective care, because